My father-in-law screamed at the top of his lungs, telling me to take my daughter and get out of his house immediately. My husband stood by and watched as I was thrown out into the pouring rain with our 1-month-old baby in my arms. They thought I was just an ordinary helpless accountant with nowhere to go and no power to fight back. 1 week later, they found out exactly how wrong they were. My name is Simone. I am 32 years old, and I will never forget the chilling sound of the heavy front door deadbolt locking firmly behind me in the middle of a torrential Atlanta downpour. It was exactly 2 in the morning. The winter rain was coming down in thick, freezing sheets, soaking completely through my thin cotton pajamas and stinging my bare arms like tiny needles. I was clutching my 1-month-old daughter Layla tightly to my chest, desperately trying to shield her fragile little body from the biting wind and the relentless storm that was raging around us. Standing there in the pitch-black driveway, shivering uncontrollably and absolutely terrified, I stared up at the towering brick facade of the grand estate I had called my home for the past 3 years. The heavy custom oak front door swung violently open again, hitting the interior hallway wall with a sickening thud that echoed over the roaring thunder above. My father-in-law Harrison loomed in the doorway like an angry shadow. At 60 years old, he was a man who prided himself immensely on his tailored bespoke suits, his exclusive country club memberships, and his revered status as a patriarch among Atlanta's elite black society. He was a prominent figure in the local logistics business scene, a proud member of prestigious social fraternities, and someone who demanded absolute respect at all times. But in that terrible moment, the polished gentleman facade was completely gone. His face was contorted with pure, unfiltered rage and deep, burning contempt. "Take your crying daughter and get out of this house," he screamed, his voice booming viciously over the loud sound of the pouring rain hitting the pavement. "You are a complete disgrace to this family and everything we have built over the generations. You never belonged with us. You are nothing but a common classless girl from the South Side, and I will not let you taint our legacy or drag our respectable name through the mud anymore." He stepped out onto the edge of the covered porch holding Layla's floral-patterned diaper bag in his large hands, with a look of absolute disgust, as if he were holding a bag of toxic waste. He hurled it down the wet stone steps. The bag hit a massive muddy puddle in the driveway, with a loud splash throwing dirty water over my bare, freezing feet. Expensive cans of baby formula, fresh, clean diapers, and a handful of Layla's tiny, carefully folded clothes spilled out into the muddy water, instantly ruined and soaked beyond repair. Layla began to wail loudly against my chest, her tiny, helpless cries cutting right through the sound of the violent storm, breaking my heart into a million jagged pieces. I looked past Harrison's towering frame, searching frantically for my husband. Tyrell slowly walked out from the shadows of the grand foyer and stood on the porch right behind his father. He was 34 years old, the man who had stood at an altar in front of our friends and family, and vowed before God to protect me and our child from any harm. But he stood there now completely cold, silent, and entirely detached from the nightmare unfolding in front of him. He was not looking at my desperate tears. He was not looking at his freezing, crying newborn daughter. He was casually tapping on the glowing screen of his smartphone, the pale blue light illuminating his completely apathetic expression. "Tyrell." I begged, my voice cracking and trembling as I tightened my protective grip around my sobbing baby to keep her warm. "Tyrell, please say something. It is freezing outside. Layla is just a tiny baby. You cannot possibly do this to us. We have nowhere to go in the middle of the night." Tyrell finally lifted his gaze from his glowing screen. He did not show a single ounce of remorse, pity, or love. "I just locked you out of all the joint banking accounts," he announced, his voice totally devoid of any human emotion, sounding more like a machine than a husband. "I canceled your credit cards and revoked your access to the family trust portal. You have absolutely zero access to my family wealth. You are clearly suffering from severe postpartum instability, Simone. You are having a major mental episode and you are acting completely unhinged right now. I cannot have this kind of chaotic, toxic energy around my respectable family or my promising career. You need to get out immediately and figure out your mental issues entirely on your own. I stood there in the flooded driveway, temporarily paralyzed by the sheer audacity and cruelty of his psychological manipulation. Postpartum instability. That was the vicious, calculated narrative they had collectively decided to spin to justify their terrible actions tonight. They were actively throwing a vulnerable mother and a newborn infant out into a dangerous winter storm at 2 in the morning, yet they were already meticulously crafting a fake story to make me look like the unstable, crazy wife. It was a highly organized, deeply vicious move designed to systematically strip me of my credibility, my dignity, and my financial resources so I could not fight back. Tyrell, who relied entirely on his father's logistics company and his generous family trust fund to survive, was ultimately a spineless coward. He was merely a puppet vice president at Harrison Logistics, a weak man who possessed absolutely no real power, talent, or wealth of his own, simply echoing his controlling father's cruel demands to secure his own comfortable, luxurious lifestyle. Suddenly, a bright, blinding flash of light hit my eyes. I blinked through the heavy pouring rain to see my sister-in-law Kendra stepping out onto the dry, covered porch. She was 30 years old, wrapped tightly in a luxurious designer silk robe, holding her perfectly manicured hand high up in the air to capture the entire pathetic scene. The red recording light on her latest model smartphone was blinking steadily in the dark. She was recording our misery for her own entertainment. Smile for the camera. Simone Kendra taunted loudly, a malicious, triumphant smirk plastered across her perfectly made-up face. I am going to show all our prestigious friends in the society exactly how the absolute trash from the South Side behaves when they cannot handle the immense pressure of high society living. You really thought you could easily blend in with our exclusive circles. You honestly thought marrying my successful brother gave you instant class and sophistication. You are just a pathetic charity case who desperately tried to marry up, and now you are finally getting exactly what you deserve. I might just post this entertaining video to my social media tomorrow so everyone in Atlanta can see the real unhinged version of you. The freezing rain continued to batter my shaking shoulders and run down my cold back. The icy water was rapidly seeping into the soft pink blanket, wrapped around little Layla, making her cry even louder. My maternal instinct, the primal, fierce, protective urge of a desperate mother, screamed at me to charge right up those wet stone steps. I wanted to snatch that expensive phone from Kendra's manicured hands and smash it into 1,000 pieces against the solid brick wall. I wanted to scream right in Tyrell's coward face and physically demand he step up and take basic responsibility for his innocent child. I wanted to unleash every single ounce of suppressed fury I possessed against Harrison and his arrogant, fake elite posturing that had made my life a living hell for 3 long years. But I did not move forward. I did not scream back at them. I did not cry any louder. As I stood there in the freezing rain, feeling the rhythmic, terrified heartbeat of my daughter against my chest, something fundamental inside my mind shifted permanently. The overwhelming panic and immediate fear suddenly subsided, instantly replaced by a chilling, absolute, and terrifying sense of clarity. I am not a hysterical, unstable woman. I am a highly trained, deeply analytical forensic accountant. I spend my entire professional life meticulously tracking hidden assets, quietly dismantling complex financial frauds, and analyzing corporate ruin from the inside out. I look at heavily doctored balance sheets, and I see the stark truth that desperate people try to hide from the world. And looking up at my husband, my father-in-law, and my sister-in-law standing so proudly on that porch, I saw them exactly as they truly were. They were bankrupt souls hiding desperately behind expensive designer labels, leased luxury cars, and inherited country club memberships that they could barely afford. They genuinely believed I was just a boring paper-pushing number cruncher. They thought my daily job was tedious and completely irrelevant to their glamorous, fast-paced lives. Because they were so deeply absorbed in their own grand illusions of infinite wealth and social status, they had never once bothered to learn what I actually do for a living. They did not know that I am a senior financial auditor at Vanguard Equity, one of the absolute most powerful and ruthless private investment firms in the entire country. They thought they held every single card in the deck. They confidently thought taking away my credit cards and locking me out of a house would break my spirit forever and leave me begging for their mercy. They had absolutely no idea that I held the literal keys to their entire financial existence. I bit my tongue hard, tasting the metallic tang of blood in my mouth. I forcefully swallowed my pride, refusing to give Kendra the chaotic, screaming reaction she so desperately wanted for her cruel, viral video. With steady, freezing hands, I pulled my phone from my wet pajama pocket. Thankfully, the screen was still working despite the heavy rain pouring over it. I calmly opened a rideshare app and requested a car, paying the expensive late-night fare with a private, secure corporate account that Tyrell knew absolutely nothing about. I carefully bent down, gathered the few unspoiled diapers from the edge of the muddy puddle, tucked them securely under my arm, and shielded Layla as best as I humanly could from the harsh wind. I turned my back on the grand estate, on my cowardly husband, and on the toxic in-laws who had treated me like disposable dirt since day one. I walked down the long, winding, tree-lined driveway toward the main road to wait in the dark for my car to arrive. Behind me, I could hear Harrison shouting one last degrading insult about my background, but the harsh sound was quickly drowned out by a loud crack of thunder and my own racing, calculating thoughts. They thought throwing a vulnerable mother and her helpless newborn out into the rain would completely break me. But when you push a strong woman out into a violent storm, you should never be surprised when she comes back as pure destructive lightning. They thought I was just an ordinary helpless accountant with nowhere to go. They had no idea I was about to surgically dismantle their entire fake empire piece by piece. Before I tell you exactly how I executed my revenge and took everything they valued, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like and subscribe button if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family who severely underestimated your worth. You will definitely not want to miss what happens next. My name is Simone, and as I stood in the quiet nursery comforting my newborn daughter, Tyrell stormed into the room. His face was flushed with a mixture of expensive bourbon and deep irritation. He did not ask if I was all right. He did not ask if our daughter was safe from the flying glass or the spilling wine downstairs. Instead, he slammed the heavy wooden door shut behind him, trapping us inside the nursery, and glared at me with pure resentment burning in his eyes. "What is wrong with you, Simone?" Tyrell hissed, keeping his voice just low enough so the guests in the hallway could not hear his sudden outburst. "My father is hosting some of the most powerful political figures in the entire state of Georgia downstairs right now. He invited Councilman Davis and his daughter Vanessa specifically to secure a massive municipal contract for the logistics company, and you are up here hiding like a spoiled, sullen child. Your terrible attitude is completely jeopardizing my father's crucial business connections." I stared at him, absolutely baffled by his twisted, delusional version of reality. "My terrible attitude?" I asked, keeping my tone deliberately flat and icy, refusing to let him see the fresh pain his cruel words inflicted. Kendra literally shoved me and deliberately poured a full glass of red wine all over my dress in front of 50 people. "She publicly humiliated the mother of your child while you stood at the bar laughing and flirting with another woman. You did not even flinch, Tyrell. You just stood there and let them treat me like garbage." Tyrell scoffed loudly, waving his hand dismissively in the air as if my valid feelings were nothing but a minor, irritating distraction. "Kendra is just clumsy, and you are being ridiculously overly sensitive as usual," he sneered, taking a menacing step closer to me. "And for the record, I was not flirting with Vanessa. I was networking. Vanessa understands how our elite world operates, and she has the exact high society polish and political influence that my father desperately needs to finalize this expansion deal. You could learn a lot from a sophisticated woman like her, instead of acting like a fragile victim every single time my family tries to include you." I felt a cold, bitter realization wash over me. He was not just defending Vanessa. He was actively comparing us and finding me severely lacking. He was regurgitating Harrison's toxic ideology word for word, completely incapable of formulating an original thought that did not directly serve his father's arrogant agenda. Tyrell was 34 years old, but he was still just a frightened, obedient little boy desperately seeking his domineering father's validation. As I looked at my husband, the man I had vowed to love and cherish, the blinders finally fell completely away. My analytical mind, trained to spot hidden patterns and uncover buried truths, began to effortlessly dissect the man standing furiously in front of me. Tyrell was incredibly weak. He proudly wore the impressive title of Vice President at Harrison Logistics, but it was nothing more than an empty hollow shell. He possessed no real executive power, no actual business acumen, and no independent financial stability. His entire luxurious lifestyle was entirely funded by Harrison's tightly controlled family trust. Tyrell was completely financially dependent on his father, chained to him by greed and incompetence. His sudden cruelty toward me was not just about my working-class background. It was a direct, glaring projection of his own monumental failures. He felt small and powerless in his father's imposing shadow, so he desperately needed someone even smaller to dominate and control. He needed a wife who would obediently absorb his family's constant abuse without ever fighting back. A human punching bag to make him feel like a strong, capable man. I finally realized with absolute chilling clarity that our marriage had never been about love. It had always been a calculated transaction. He had married me because I was reliable, low maintenance, and safe. I was the quiet, hardworking accountant who would balance his chaotic personal books and silently clean up his endless messes while asking for absolutely nothing in return. Tyrell paced the length of the nursery, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the soft pink rug I had carefully chosen for our daughter. He ran a frustrated hand over his perfectly groomed hair, his agitation mounting rapidly. "You are completely ruining this entire christening," he complained bitterly, his voice rising in volume. This was supposed to be a flawless, perfect event to showcase our family stability to the councilmen. But you are making us look like a divided, messy joke. I cannot trust you to handle even the simplest social obligations without causing a massive, embarrassing scene. He stopped pacing and turned his angry gaze toward the crib where little Layla was sleeping soundly. He stared down at her tiny, innocent face for a long, uncomfortable moment. The silence in the room grew heavy and suffocating. When he finally looked back up at me, his eyes were completely devoid of any paternal warmth or basic human affection. They were cold, calculating, and viciously cruel. "Look at her, Simone Tyrell," said his voice dropping into a sinister, mocking tone. "Just look at the baby you brought into my house. She does not look anything like me. She does not have my eye shape. She does not have my facial structure. Her complexion is completely different from anyone in the entire Harrison family line. You really expect me to believe she is actually my blood?" The sheer audacity of his vile accusation hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My breath caught sharply in my throat. Layla was barely 1 month old. She was a beautiful, perfect blend of both our families, a completely innocent child who had done absolutely nothing to deserve this kind of vile rejection from her own father. "What are you saying?" I demanded, my voice dangerously quiet, trembling with suppressed fury. "You know exactly what I'm saying." Tyrell snapped back, his face twisting into an ugly, hateful sneer. "You trapped me, Simone. You saw a wealthy, successful man from a prominent family, and you deliberately got pregnant to secure your permanent meal ticket. You knew I was starting to realize how incompatible we truly are, so you anchored yourself to my family wealth with a baby. I want a paternity test immediately. I am not going to spend the rest of my life financially supporting another man's child while you sit around my estate spending my father's hard-earned money." His cruel, baseless accusations echoed loudly off the nursery walls, filling the peaceful room with toxic, unforgivable poison. He was accusing me of trapping him, of being a desperate gold digger, of being unfaithful. It was the ultimate, unforgivable insult, designed specifically to break me down completely, to make me doubt my own sanity and worth. He was using the oldest, most pathetic trick in the abusive playbook to completely deflect from his own glaring inadequacies and his family's blatant disrespect. But his vicious attack did not make me crumble. It did not make me burst into hysterical tears or fall to my knees, begging for his belief and validation. Instead, It fueled a cold, calculating, and absolute rage deep within the core of my soul. He wanted a paternity test. He wanted to question my integrity and loyalty. He wanted to strip away my dignity and brand me as a scheming, deceptive liar. Fine. If he wanted to play a ruthless, dirty game involving legal documents, hidden truths, and financial ruin, I was more than ready to play. He fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. I was not just a naive working-class girl who had lucked into a wealthy marriage. I was a senior forensic certified public accountant. My entire professional existence revolved around uncovering the exact things that arrogant, entitled men like Tyrell and Harrison desperately tried to keep buried in the dark. I knew how to follow the money, how to read the hidden stories buried deep within dense balance sheets, and how to surgically dismantle a fraudulent empire from the inside out. I stood my ground, squaring my shoulders and looking Tyrell directly in his cold, empty eyes. I refused to let him see even a single fraction of the deep, agonizing pain tearing at my heart. "You want a paternity test?" I asked, my voice as hard and unforgiving as solid ice. "Fine. Arrange the medical appointment. We will get the DNA test done as soon as possible. But you need to understand something very clearly right now, Tyrell. Once that legal paper proves she is your biological daughter, there is no going back from this moment. You are permanently destroying our family today." Tyrell laughed, a harsh, dismissive, arrogant sound that grated against my ears. "This family was already destroyed the minute you walked through the front doors of this estate, Simone. You were a massive mistake, a temporary lapse in my judgment. My father was entirely right about you from the very beginning. You will never be a true Harrison. You simply do not have the breeding or the class to exist in our world." He turned around sharply, his expensive suit jacket swirling around his frame, and marched toward the heavy wooden door. "Have the baby ready for the medical clinic tomorrow morning?" He threw the callous order over his shoulder without even glancing back. "And stay out of the grand ballroom for the rest of the evening. We do not need your embarrassing, pathetic presence ruining the rest of this important networking event. My father and Vanessa are busy finalizing things." The heavy door slammed shut loudly behind him, vibrating the nursery walls, and finally waking Layla. She began to cry softly, a fragile, helpless sound that instantly shattered my rigid composure. I rushed to the crib and carefully scooped her up, holding her warm, tiny body tightly against my chest, gently rocking her back and forth until her small cries slowly subsided into quiet, rhythmic hiccups. I stood alone in the quiet nursery, entirely surrounded by the beautiful, soft pink walls and the expensive, useless baby furniture Tyrell's family had purchased strictly for social media photos. The dark red wine stain on my dress felt cold and sticky against my skin. My marriage was officially dead-killed by my husband's cowardly submission to his father's toxic empire and his own pathetic, deep-seated insecurities. But as I held my innocent daughter, wiping away the few stray tears that had managed to escape my eyes, I made a silent, unbreakable promise to her and to myself. Tyrell and Harrison had just declared total, uncompromising war on the wrong woman. They mistakenly believed they held all the power, all the wealth, and all the social influence. They confidently thought they could casually discard me like a piece of useless trash and replace me with a politically connected heiress to save their crumbling, pathetic logistics company. They were completely blind to the fact that I held the absolute power to legally, professionally, and entirely obliterate their entire existence. I was going to tear down their fake, fraudulent empire, expose their dark, hidden financial crimes to the federal government, and leave them with absolutely nothing. The countdown to their complete and utter destruction had officially started right now. The next morning arrived with a suffocating, heavy silence that pressed down on the entire estate. The air inside the grand house was thick with unresolved tension and unspoken threats. I had barely slept, spending the long, dark hours of the night holding Layla and mapping out my survival strategy. Tyrell had spent the night in the guest suite, a clear, childish demonstration of his manufactured outrage over my refusal to bow down to his family the night before. When I finally walked downstairs to the massive gourmet kitchen to prepare Layla's morning bottle, I could hear Tyrell pacing furiously inside his meticulously decorated home office down the hall. He was barking loudly into his cell phone, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, desperately trying to appease someone on the other end of the line. The heavy mahogany door to his office suddenly flew open, and Tyrell stormed out completely dressed in a sharp-tailored navy suit. He was moving with a frantic, aggressive energy, clearly running late for whatever crucial meeting his father had demanded he attend. In his reckless haste, he knocked his arm against the small console table near the doorway. A full, steaming mug of dark coffee tipped over violently, crashing onto the expensive imported hardwood floor and splashing dark liquid across the pristine white baseboards. Tyrell stopped, glared at the spreading brown puddle, and then shot a look of pure, unadulterated contempt directly at me. "Clean that mess up immediately, Simone," he ordered, his voice dripping with condescension. "The cleaning staff does not arrive until noon, and I cannot have my father seeing this disaster when he comes over for our strategy meeting later today. I have a massive corporate acquisition to finalize, and I do not have time to deal with your domestic incompetence this morning. Make yourself useful for once." He did not wait for my response. He turned on his heel and marched swiftly out the front door, slamming it so hard the entire house seemed to vibrate. I stood alone in the quiet hallway, staring at the spilled coffee soaking into the expensive wood. A bitter, ironic smile crossed my face. He wanted me to clean up his mess. He wanted me to play the role of the silent, obedient, subservient wife. I calmly walked to the kitchen, retrieved a roll of paper towels and some cleaning spray, and headed into his home office. The office was a shrine to Tyrell's inflated ego, filled with meaningless plaques, framed photographs of him shaking hands with local politicians, and heavy leather furniture. As I knelt down to wipe up the spilled coffee near the doorway, my eyes naturally drifted toward his massive polished oak desk. Tyrell had been in such a frantic, disorganized rush to leave that he had completely forgotten a fundamental rule of corporate security. His high-end laptop was sitting wide open, brightly illuminated, and completely unlocked. Normally, I would have simply finished cleaning the floor, ignored his computer, and walked away. I had spent 3 years meticulously respecting his privacy and staying entirely out of his business affairs, mostly because he constantly reminded me that a simple accountant could never understand the complex, high-level logistics industry. But today was different. After the vicious DNA accusations and the cruel public humiliation of the previous night, all bets were officially off. I stood up slowly, tossing the soiled paper towels into the wastebasket, and walked deliberately over to his desk. I looked down at the glowing screen. Tyrell had left his browser open directly to the highly restricted top-tier administrative shared drive for Harrison Logistics. This was the highly secure internal portal that only Harrison Tyrell and their chief financial officer had the clearance to access. My eyes scanned the neatly organized folders, and instantly my professional instincts flared to life. I am not a standard entry-level bookkeeper. I am a senior financial auditor. I spend my days relentlessly hunting down corporate fraud, exposing hidden liabilities, and ripping apart fabricated financial statements for one of the most powerful equity firms in the nation. I do not just read numbers on a page, I brutally dissect them. I pulled out Tyrell's plush leather desk chair, sat down, and placed my hands on the keyboard. I opened a folder labeled Internal Quarterly Reviews and began to scroll. Within 5 minutes, the polished, unassailable facade of Harrison Logistics began to completely disintegrate right before my eyes. The numbers did not just look slightly off. They were screaming a story of monumental, desperate fraud. I opened a second window and pulled up their official tax filings alongside their internal operating ledgers. My eyes darted rapidly across the screen, calculating discrepancies faster than a machine. Harrison Logistics was not a thriving, dominant empire. It was a spectacular, rotting house of cards actively drowning in massive, unrecoverable debt. Harrison had been utilizing a highly illegal double-entry bookkeeping system for at least the past 5 years. There was one set of beautifully fabricated, highly profitable books designed specifically to show aggressive investors and the public, and another hidden, disastrous set of books reflecting the grim reality. The company was bleeding millions of dollars annually. Their highly touted municipal contracts were actually operating at a severe loss. They were illegally shifting funds between dozens of obscure shell companies to artificially inflate their daily operating revenue. Worse still, they were actively hiding millions of dollars in taxable income, creating a massive, ticking time bomb of federal tax evasion that could easily trigger severe criminal indictments for everyone involved in the executive suite. Harrison was stealing from his own company to fund his lavish country club lifestyle, and Tyrell was blindly signing off on documents he clearly did not have the basic intelligence to comprehend. I clicked through folders containing desperate emails from angry suppliers, notices of default from obscure private lenders, and frantic internal memos demanding drastic cost-cutting measures. The immense, untouchable wealth they constantly flaunted in my face, the wealth they used to justify treating me like absolute dirt, was completely fake. They were broke. They were heavily leveraged, federally non-compliant, and standing right on the very edge of total financial annihilation. This sudden revelation explained everything. It explained why Harrison was so insanely desperate to force a connection between Tyrell and Vanessa. He did not just want her prestigious political pedigree. He desperately needed to secure her father's direct access to emergency municipal bailouts and lucrative city contracts to plug the massive bleeding holes in his sinking ship. Tyrell was not just a coward, he was a highly vulnerable, deeply compromised liability. I kept digging, my heart beating with a cold, triumphant rhythm. I needed to see exactly what their exit strategy was. I opened a separate, heavily encrypted folder labeled Project Salvation. Inside was a massive, highly detailed corporate buyout proposal. Harrison was aggressively trying to sell his rotting, fraudulent logistics company to a major private equity firm. The proposal asked for a staggering $20 million buyout, framing the deal as a highly lucrative acquisition of a legacy transportation network. It was a total scam, a desperate final attempt to secure a massive cash payout and run away before the federal authorities finally caught up with their massive tax evasion scheme. I scrolled rapidly to the top of the executive summary to see exactly which private equity firm they were trying to defraud. The bold black letters stamped across the official letterhead made me stop breathing for a fraction of a second. The target buyer was Vanguard Equity. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face as I read the name of my exact employer. Vanguard Equity was the very firm where I currently held the title of Senior Financial Auditor. For 3 entire years, Harrison, Tyrell, and Kendra had relentlessly mocked my career. They had constantly belittled my hard work, rolling their eyes whenever I mentioned my job, writing me off as a tedious, invisible paper pusher who simply balanced boring spreadsheets for a faceless corporate entity. They were so deeply consumed by their own monumental arrogance and their fake social hierarchy that they never once bothered to ask what my actual corporate title was. They never bothered to learn that I worked directly for the executive board of the exact same private equity firm they were now desperately trying to swindle for $20 million. They had unknowingly placed their entire financial salvation directly into the hands of the very woman they had just abused, humiliated, and threatened to destroy. I quickly plugged a secure flash drive into Tyrell's laptop and began methodically copying every single fraudulent ledger, every fake tax return, and every damning email. I watched the heavy progress bar slowly fill across the glowing screen. Each downloaded file represented another solid nail in their meticulously crafted coffin. My breathing steadied, and a powerful sense of absolute control washed over me. The ultimate reckoning that they had blindly brought upon themselves was finally rapidly approaching right now. I pulled the flash drive from the USB port the second the progress bar vanished. The small metal device felt heavy in my palm, loaded with enough explosive financial evidence to dismantle the Harrison legacy permanently. I did not stop there. I routed the most damning documents directly to the encrypted wireless printer tucked inside the home office closet. The machine whirred to life, quickly spitting out pages of double-entry ledgers, hidden tax liabilities, and the fabricated Vanguard Equity buyout proposal. I gathered the warm sheets of paper, stapled them into a neat, undeniable stack of federal crimes, and waited for the architects of this fraud to return. By early afternoon, the heavy mahogany front door swung open. Tyrell and Harrison strode into the grand foyer, their voices echoing loudly off the marble floors. They were arguing intensely about municipal contracts and vendor delays. Harrison sounded furious, his usual polished demeanor cracking under the immense crushing weight of his hidden bankruptcy. Tyrell sounded defensive, whining about how hard he was trying to secure Vanessa's attention to please his father. I stepped out of the shadow of the hallway and stood perfectly still at the entrance of the living room, holding the thick stack of printed evidence in my right hand. They both froze when they saw me. Tyrell immediately rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, dramatic sigh of annoyance. "I told you to clean up my office, Simone," Tyrell snapped, aggressively adjusting his expensive silk tie. "I do not have time for whatever domestic complaint you are holding in your hand right now. We are dealing with high-level corporate issues that you could not possibly comprehend." "I am not holding a domestic complaint," I said smoothly, my voice cold and dangerously calm. "I am holding the heavily doctored quarterly reviews, the hidden offshore liabilities, and the completely fabricated balance sheets for Harrison Logistics." I stepped forward and tossed the thick stack of papers directly onto the expensive glass coffee table. The documents landed with a loud, definitive smack. "You are not dealing with high-level corporate issues, Tyrell. You are dealing with massive systemic corporate fraud." Harrison went entirely rigid. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale shade of gray. His eyes darted from the papers on the table to my face, quickly calculating exactly how much I knew. Tyrell just looked confused, his limited intellect struggling to process the severe accusation. "What nonsense are you babbling about now?" Harrison demanded, recovering his aggressive posture and stepping toward me with a threatening glare. "You have absolutely no idea what those documents mean. You are just a simple entry-level accountant invading my son's private workspace." "I know exactly what they mean," I shot back, meeting his furious gaze without blinking. "You are running a massive double-entry bookkeeping scheme. You are actively hiding millions of dollars in taxable income from the federal government, and you are currently attempting to sell a financially ruined, bankrupt shell of a company to Vanguard Equity for $20 million. I pointed a steady finger at the buyout proposal sitting on top of the pile. "Submitting these specific forged documents to a private equity firm across state lines is not just a minor accounting error. It is a severe federal crime. It is wire fraud. It is tax evasion. When the authorities find out, and they will find out, both of you are going directly to federal prison." For a brief, satisfying moment, I watched true, unfiltered terror flash across Harrison's arrogant face. He realized his entire fake empire was completely exposed. He realized his freedom was hanging by a very thin, fragile thread. A normal, rational human being would have panicked. A sane person would have begged for silence or offered a desperate apology. But Harrison was an extreme narcissist. He was a ruthless, cornered animal, and instead of surrendering, he instantly went on the most vicious offensive imaginable. Harrison let out a loud, mocking laugh that sounded completely unnatural. He turned his back to me and looked directly at his son, shaking his head with exaggerated theatrical pity. "Tyrell, look at your wife," Harrison said, his voice dripping with fake paternal concern. "Just look at her. This is exactly what I warned you about. This is severe postpartum psychosis. She is completely losing her grip on reality." "What are you doing?" I demanded, my anger rising at his blatant, shameless manipulation. "Do not try to gaslight your way out of federal tax evasion. The proof is sitting right there on the table." Tyrell looked at the papers, then looked at his father, his weak mind easily swayed by Harrison's commanding tone. "Dad, what is she talking about?" Tyrell asked nervously, clearly terrified of the sudden mention of prison. "She is making up wild, unhinged delusions," Tyrell Harrison lied smoothly, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "She just had a baby. Her hormones are completely destroyed. She is hallucinating financial crimes because her working-class brain simply cannot comprehend standard complex corporate logistics. She is taking normal operating debt and spinning it into some crazy, paranoid conspiracy theory because she is mentally unstable. We read about this happening to women from her background all the time. She's having a total mental breakdown right in our foyer." I stood there, absolutely disgusted by his evil, calculated strategy. Harrison was weaponizing my recent childbirth to entirely discredit my professional financial analysis. He was actively trying to convince his own son that the mother of his newborn child was completely insane just to protect his fraudulent, sinking empire. "Tyrell, I am not crazy, I stated firmly, looking my husband directly in his eyes. I am a forensic auditor. I track financial crimes for a living. Read the documents yourself. The company is completely bankrupt. But Tyrell did not read the documents. He did not even reach for them. He looked at me with deep, unmistakable disgust. He had always been terrified of his father, always desperate for Harrison's approval. Believing his father's lie was infinitely easier than facing the terrifying reality that his luxurious life was entirely fake and built on massive federal crimes. You really have lost your mind, Simone, Tyrell said, shaking his head in absolute contempt. My father is a pillar of the Atlanta business community. Harrison Logistics is a legacy institution. You are seriously standing here acting like a complete lunatic, accusing us of felonies because you cannot handle the stress of motherhood. You are a danger to this family and a danger to my daughter. Harrison seized the opening instantly. He moved closer to Tyrell, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial, urgent tone, though he made sure I could still hear every single cruel word. Listen to me, son, Harrison urged, gripping Tyrell's shoulder tightly. We cannot have this chaotic, toxic energy destroying our lives right now. We are at a critical juncture. The Vanguard deal is our top priority, but we need emergency, immediate capital to keep the lights on until the acquisition clears. We need Vanessa. Her father is a city councilman. Her family has direct access to the municipal emergency funds we require to bridge the gap. Tyrell swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously around the room. But Simone is my wife, Dad. What am I supposed to do with her? She is a massive liability. Tyrell Harrison snapped violently, dropping the fake concern entirely. She is snooping through our private corporate files and threatening to run to the authorities with her crazy delusions. If she starts screaming these insane accusations to the wrong people, Vanguard will walk away from the deal, and we will lose absolutely everything. You need to replace her immediately. Vanessa is ready, willing, and wealthy. She comes from our elite world. She understands how power works. You need to get Vanessa into this house today, and you need to get rid of this crazy, unstable woman right now before she ruins us. Tyrell looked at me, then looked back at his father. The choice between his loyal wife and his desperate greed took less than 10 seconds to make. He nodded slowly, fully accepting his father's dark, brutal command. You are right, Dad, Tyrell muttered, his eyes cold and dead. She is totally unhinged. We cannot risk the company or our social standing. Harrison smirked, a vicious, triumphant expression crossing his face. Good boy. Lock her out of everything. Cut off the credit cards. Drain the joint accounts. Leave her with absolutely nothing so she cannot afford a lawyer to spread these delusions. Show her exactly what happens when trash from the South Side tries to threaten the Harrison legacy. I silently turned around and walked up the carpeted stairs to get my daughter. I knew they were going to throw me out into the dark, freezing night. Their arrogant cruelty had perfectly armed the exact Vanguard executive who would reject their plan. The morning sunlight filtered weakly through the faded floral curtains of Renee's modest apartment in Southside Atlanta. I sat completely still on her worn beige corduroy sofa, staring down at my daughter. Layla was sleeping peacefully, bundled in a warm fleece blanket Renee had hastily pulled from her hall closet when we arrived, freezing and soaked at 3 a.m. My best friend since high school had asked no questions. She simply paid my Uber driver, ushered us inside, wrapped me in dry clothes, and made a strong pot of dark roast coffee. Now Renee sat quietly at the small kitchen table across the room, watching me with deep and protective concern. I was physically exhausted, my muscles aching from the shivering and the sheer adrenaline drop, but my mind was operating with terrifying and razor-sharp precision. My phone buzzed against the scuffed wooden coffee table, shattering the quiet sanctuary of the small apartment. I picked it up, my thumb swiping across the cracked screen. An email notification flashed at the top of my inbox. It was from a prominent and high-priced family law firm located in the wealthy Buckhead district, a firm known for representing Atlanta's most ruthless elite. The subject line read simply, "Emergency ex parte custody order and financial separation notice." I opened the email, my eyes scanning the attached legal documents with the cold and detached efficiency of a professional auditor reviewing a hostile takeover. Tyrell and Harrison had moved with blinding speed, attempting to crush me before the sun even fully rose. The legal petition was a masterpiece of fabricated character assassination. Tyrell was filing for an emergency, an temporary order of sole physical and legal custody of Layla. His expensive lawyer had woven a horrific and completely fictional narrative citing my alleged severe and untreated postpartum psychosis, claiming I was prone to violent outbursts and had willfully abandoned the marital home in the middle of a dangerous winter storm. They were weaponizing my forced midnight eviction, twisting the narrative to make it look like I had recklessly endangered our newborn daughter by fleeing into the rain during a manic episode. The legal documents formally instructed me to surrender Layla to Child Protective Services, or Tyrell's legal counsel, within 48 hours, pending a full psychological evaluation. Harrison had clearly utilized his extensive political connections and deep pockets to push the emergency order through a friendly judge before regular court hours even officially began. They wanted to strip my child from my arms to ensure I remained utterly broken, distracted, and powerless to expose their massive corporate fraud. I closed the legal attachment and immediately logged into my personal banking application to assess the financial damage. I needed to know exactly how thoroughly they believed they had crippled my resources. The loading circle spun for a fraction of a second before revealing my joint checking and savings account balances. Both accounts read exactly $12.43. Tyrell had systematically drained every single penny of our shared marital funds, transferring tens of thousands of dollars into a private and untraceable offshore trust account managed by his father's corrupt financial officers. He had canceled my primary credit cards, revoked my access to the family health insurance policy, and locked me out of the digital security portals for our Beacon Hill estate. He intended to starve me out, leaving me entirely destitute, so I could not afford to hire a competent attorney to fight his fraudulent custody petition. Before I could even process the sheer magnitude of his financial betrayal, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a direct text message from my vicious sister-in-law, Kendra. I opened the message and felt a sudden and sharp spike of absolute disgust. The message contained no text, only a high-resolution and full-color photograph. It was a selfie taken in the massive and custom-built master bedroom of my home. Kendra was smiling brightly, holding up a glass of expensive morning mimosa, but the true poison was in the background of the image. Standing behind Kendra, looking perfectly at home in my private sanctuary, was Vanessa. The wealthy and politically connected heiress was casually unpacking her designer luggage, hanging her expensive silk dresses directly into my custom California closet. Vanessa was already moving into my house, taking over my personal space less than 8 hours after Harrison and Tyrell had thrown me and Layla out into the freezing rain. They had not wasted a single minute. Tyrell was actively replacing me, moving his lucrative new target right into the master suite to secure the emergency municipal funding his father desperately needed to keep their sinking logistics company afloat. They were parading their victory, flaunting their perceived absolute power, and rubbing my face in my total displacement. They fully expected me to break down completely. They anticipated a frantic and hysterical phone call. They wanted me to show up at the front gates of the estate screaming and crying, begging for access to my bank accounts, pleading for my clothes, and reinforcing their carefully crafted narrative of a crazy, unstable, and desperate woman from the South Side who simply could not handle the immense pressure of their elite world. I did not give them a single tear. I did not scream, and I certainly did not call my cowardly husband to beg for a single dime. I gently kissed Layla's warm forehead, inhaling the sweet and innocent scent of my beautiful daughter. I slowly stood up from the worn corduroy sofa and walked over to the kitchen table where Renee was sitting. I handed Layla to my best friend. Renee took the sleeping baby without a word, holding her securely, her eyes silently promising to protect my child with her own life. "I need you to watch her for a few hours, Renee," I said, my voice steady, cold, and completely devoid of fear. "I have some very important corporate business to handle today." Renee nodded firmly, adjusting the fleece blanket around Layla. "Take all the time you need, Simone. I have got her. Go do what you have to do to those monsters." I walked over to the small and scuffed dining table where I had placed my heavy and waterproof leather work bag the night before. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out my Vanguard Equity issued and heavily encrypted corporate laptop. The sleek and matte black machine felt powerful and familiar under my fingertips. I set it down on the table, opened the screen, and rapidly typed in my complex and multi-tier security passwords. The system booted up instantly, connecting to the highly secure and heavily monitored global server of one of the most ruthless private equity firms on the planet. The transition from a vulnerable and abused victim to an absolute apex predator happened the exact moment I launched my specialized financial auditing software. All the fear, the cold, the rejection, and the deep emotional pain from the night before vanished completely, replaced by a crystalline and hyper-focused determination. My in-laws were incredibly arrogant, and their massive and unchecked arrogance had caused them to make a series of fatal and irreversible errors. They believed they held all the power because they possessed a long lineage of old money and deep political connections. They believed draining a joint checking account and filing a fraudulent emergency custody order would render me completely helpless. But they were operating under a massive and fundamental delusion. In their frantic rush to secure Vanessa's political connections and protect their fraudulent logistics empire, they had completely forgotten one crucial and unalterable legal fact about the grand estate they had just aggressively evicted me from. They assumed the massive and sprawling mansion belonged to the Harrison family trust. They assumed Tyrell held the ultimate authority over the property because he was a Harrison, because he paid the utility bills, and because his father loved to host his elite society events in the grand ballroom. They were wrong. 3 years ago, Tyrell had secretly destroyed his own credit score. He had accumulated a massive and hidden mountain of illicit sports gambling debts that he desperately begged me to hide from his domineering father. He was terrified Harrison would cut off his trust fund if the truth ever came out. When we decided to purchase that beautiful and imposing estate, Tyrell's credit was completely toxic. No reputable bank in the state of Georgia would ever approve him for a mortgage of that magnitude. Harrison had refused to pay for the house in cash, claiming it was time for Tyrell to build his own asset portfolio. So I stepped in and handled the transaction. I used my impeccable and top-tier credit score. I used my massive corporate signing bonuses from Vanguard Equity. I navigated the complex real estate closing entirely on my own, establishing a private and highly secure limited liability company specifically for the purchase. The estate did not belong to the Harrison family trust. Tyrell's name was nowhere on the official deed, nowhere on the mortgage documents, and nowhere on the municipal property tax records. I owned that house. I was the sole and uncontested legal owner of the exact same property they had just violently kicked me out of. And right now my abusive husband, my cruel sister-in-law, and my husband's wealthy new mistress were all comfortably sleeping, unpacking, and laughing inside a private residence that belonged entirely to me. They were legally trespassing on my property. They had just initiated a ruthless legal war over my innocent daughter, wrongly assuming I was completely powerless to stop them. They never anticipated that I possessed the definitive legal power to rip the roof right off their heads in broad daylight. They believed my career was utterly irrelevant, failing to realize that forensic accountants exist specifically to dismantle people exactly like them. They had awoken an adversary who would not fight with loud and messy emotions, but with undeniable and ironclad financial records. My first strategic strike was not going to be a dramatic phone call or a desperate plea. It was going to be an immediate and heavily armed legal assault on the very foundation of their elite lifestyle. The time for silent suffering had officially concluded. The era of utter destruction was beginning right now, and I was going to enjoy utterly destroying them. My fingers flew across the keyboard with a frantic but highly controlled energy. The very first order of business was reclaiming my territory. Harrison and Tyrell had always paraded around that massive Beacon Hill-style estate as if it were the crown jewel of their precious family trust. They hosted their elite cigar nights in the den through lavish catered dinners in the formal dining room, and treated every square inch of that property as a testament to the Harrison legacy. They were entirely convinced that Tyrell was the master of the house. They were so blinded by their own patriarchal arrogance that they never bothered to verify the actual legal documentation sitting in the county property registry. 3 years ago, our marriage had faced its first major hidden crisis. Behind his polished corporate exterior and his expensive tailored suits, Tyrell was hiding a massive toxic secret. He had developed a severe sports gambling addiction. He had been quietly hemorrhaging money, placing reckless bets on overseas matches and underground syndicates. When his devastating losses finally caught up to him, his personal credit score was entirely obliterated. He was drowning in debt and completely terrified that his father would discover his humiliating weakness. Harrison demanded absolute perfection, and Tyrell knew that exposing his gambling debts would result in him being immediately cut off from the lucrative family trust. He had literally dropped to his knees on the floor of our cramped apartment, crying and begging me to help him hide his massive financial disaster from his father. When Harrison abruptly demanded that Tyrell purchase a grand estate to elevate the family image and host political events, Tyrell was in a complete panic. No reputable lending institution in the state would even look at his application. His financial profile was a toxic wasteland. That was when I stepped in, playing the role of the loyal, supportive wife. I utilized my impeccable credit score, my extensive financial background, and the massive corporate signing bonuses I had quietly accumulated from Vanguard equity. I orchestrated the entire real estate transaction entirely on my own. To protect my own hard-earned assets from his ongoing gambling liability, I formed a private holding company. I named it Southside Horizon, a subtle nod to the working-class roots my in-laws constantly mocked. I purchased the sprawling mansion outright under my holding company. I signed the heavy stack of closing documents alone. Tyrell was incredibly relieved that I had saved his reputation. He happily agreed to keep his name completely off the deed, the mortgage, and all local municipal tax records. He was just grateful to have a shiny new toy to show off to his demanding father. Harrison, in his infinite and blinding arrogance, simply assumed his son had finalized the purchase, using an advance on his future inheritance. I never corrected him. Tyrell never corrected him. It was a convenient, silent lie that protected his fragile ego. And now that carefully maintained lie was going to be the exact instrument of their humiliating downfall. They had aggressively kicked me out into the freezing storm, completely forgetting that they were merely unauthorized guests living inside my personal asset. Vanessa was currently hanging her expensive designer dresses inside a closet that I legally owned. Kendra was sipping mimosas in a kitchen that my corporate bonuses had paid for. They were legally trespassing on my private property, and I was going to remove them with extreme prejudice. I opened my encrypted email portal and typed in the name Donovan Sterling. He was widely known as the most ruthless, aggressive, and unsympathetic real estate attorney in the entire state of Georgia. He specialized in high-profile corporate evictions, hostile property takeovers, and swift, brutal asset recovery. He did not care about family drama tiers or high society status. He only cared about the ironclad letter of the law. I attached the official property deed, the articles of incorporation for my holding company, and a clear, concise summary of the situation. I hit send and waited. Less than 15 minutes later, my phone vibrated. It was a direct call from Donovan Sterling himself. I answered the phone, keeping my voice completely devoid of any emotional wavering. I explained the midnight eviction, the immediate presence of unauthorized individuals in my home, and my absolute intent to reclaim my property without any delay. I informed him that my husband had no legal claim to the property, no marital equity in my separate corporate holding company, and absolutely no lease agreement granting him the right to occupy the premises. They are squatters, I explained coldly. I want them removed immediately. Donovan reviewed the digital files I had sent him while we were on the line. I could hear the rapid clicking of his keyboard in the background. His response was precisely what I needed to hear. The documentation is flawless. He confirmed, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that radiated legal authority. Your husband has no ownership rights. His sister and his guest are legally trespassing. Given the fact that they forcefully locked you out of your own property and are currently occupying it without your consent, we do not need to go through a standard lengthy tenant eviction process. We can file an emergency ejectment action and a criminal trespass warrant. We will have a judge sign off on an expedited order before the courts close for the day. I felt a cold, sharp thrill of satisfaction. How soon can we execute the warrant? I asked, my eyes fixed on the rain still lightly tapping against the window. I want this handled with maximum visibility and absolute undeniable authority. Donovan chuckled a dry, humorless sound. I will personally walk the emergency petition into the judge's chambers this morning. We can execute the removal order by late this afternoon. We will coordinate directly with the local sheriff department to ensure a police escort is present to supervise their immediate removal from your property. They will not have a single legal leg to stand on. They will be given exactly 5 minutes to gather whatever they can carry before being escorted off the premises. If they resist, they will be arrested for criminal trespassing. That is exactly what I want, I replied, my voice steady and resolute. I want them removed today. I want them to feel the exact same sheer panic and absolute displacement they forced upon me and my infant daughter just a few hours ago. We finalized the legal strategy, and I electronically transferred his substantial retainer fee using the secure corporate account Tyrell could not access. As I ended the call, Renee walked back into the living room holding a freshly warmed bottle for Layla. She had been listening quietly to my side of the conversation, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and deep admiration. "You are really going to kick them out with the police?" she asked, handing me the bottle. I took the bottle and gently began feeding my daughter. "I am not just kicking them out, Renee. I am sending a very clear, undeniable message. They wanted to strip me of my dignity and leave me with nothing. I am going to show them that I possess more power in my single signature than their entire fake dynasty has built in a century. I am going to let them pack their bags and celebrate their new life with Vanessa. And right at the absolute peak of their arrogant joy, I am going to pull the rug completely out from under them." The trap was officially set, armed, and ticking down to a highly explosive detonation. I pictured Vanessa, the wealthy heiress they had so desperately brought in to replace me, currently arranging her designer shoes and expensive makeup in my master bathroom. I pictured Kendra smugly parading around my hallways, thinking she had successfully eliminated the Southside trash from their pristine environment. I pictured Tyrell completely relieved that he had obeyed his tyrannical father and secured a wealthy new target to fund his fake lifestyle. They were all currently living inside a beautiful, comfortable delusion. I sat back against the worn fabric of the sofa watching Layla peacefully drink her milk. The contrast between my current physical surroundings and the massive legal strike I had just launched was staggering. I was sitting in a modest, cramped apartment wearing borrowed clothes, having been literally thrown into the street. Yet I was the one holding the absolute authority. I was the one directing a high-powered attorney and the local police force to dismantle their comfortable reality. The beauty of this particular power move was its complete and utter silence. Tyrell and Harrison were actively bracing for a hysterical, messy, emotional outburst. They fully expected me to flood their phones with desperate text messages. They anticipated me showing up at the security gate screaming and crying, begging for my clothes, begging for a chance to explain myself, begging for access to the baby formula they had maliciously ruined in the mud. They wanted a chaotic spectacle they could easily dismiss and mock. Instead, I was giving them absolute deafening silence. The lack of response would confuse them at first, then falsely reassure them. They would mistake my strategic quiet for total surrender. They would assume I was simply sitting in a cheap motel somewhere crying uncontrollably and accepting my permanent defeat. They would lower their defenses entirely, celebrating their swift, brutal victory over the weak accountant. But while they celebrated their fake triumph, the legal machinery of their destruction was already moving rapidly through the court system. The emergency ejectment order was being typed, printed, and signed by a judge. The sheriff deputies were being dispatched. The moving trucks were waiting in the wings. Every single piece of my plan was falling into perfect alignment. The real estate strike was only the very first phase of my retaliation. It was the physical displacement, the immediate removal of their shelter and their false sense of security. But it was not the killing blow. That required a much larger, far more devastating approach. I needed to destroy the very core of their arrogance. I needed to annihilate Harrison Logistics and ensure that Vanguard Equity severed all ties with their fraudulent operation. I finished feeding Layla, burped her gently against my shoulder, and laid her back down in her makeshift bed. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, visualizing the grand, imposing glass towers of the Vanguard Equity corporate headquarters located in the heart of the financial district. That was my true domain. That was the battlefield where I possessed ultimate, uncontested authority. Harrison and Tyrell thought they were expertly manipulating the system to secure a $20 million bailout. They thought they were clever, sophisticated businessmen, outsmarting a faceless corporate entity. I opened my encrypted laptop once again, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I drafted a high-priority urgent communication directly to the executive board of Vanguard Equity. I was ending my maternity leave effective immediately. I was calling an emergency risk assessment meeting. The storm they had thrown me into was over. The lightning strike was fully prepared. I hit send, confirming the meeting. The countdown to the boardroom massacre had officially begun. I closed the laptop and took a deep breath, letting the finality of my decision wash over me. The digital wheels were in motion, and I needed to prepare myself for the physical battlefield. I turned to Renee, who was already holding a fresh set of clothes she had borrowed from a neighbor who worked in corporate law. It was a sharp, tailored black suit that fit me perfectly. I dressed quickly, securing my hair into a tight professional bun. I applied a minimalist layer of makeup, erasing the physical evidence of the midnight storm and the exhaustion of the past 24 hours. Looking in the mirror, I saw the senior financial auditor staring back. The vulnerable mother who had cried in the rain was gone, securely locked away until my daughter was safe and my enemies were ruined. I kissed Layla softly on her cheek, whispering a promise that I would return with our future completely secured. Renee squeezed my shoulder silently, offering her unwavering support. I walked out of the apartment and ordered a premium corporate car service, billing it directly to my executive expense account. The sleek black town car arrived within minutes, shielding me from the lingering morning drizzle. The drive to the financial district was swift. Through the tinted windows, I watched the Atlanta skyline emerge, dominated by the towering mirrored glass structure of Vanguard Equity. The building was a fortress of modern capitalism, an imposing monolith where billions of dollars changed hands and corporate fates were decided daily. This was my sanctuary. This was where numbers reigned supreme and emotional manipulation went to die. I stepped out of the vehicle and strode through the massive revolving doors of the main lobby. The polished marble floors clicked under my heels with a sharp, authoritative rhythm. I bypassed the standard employee security checkpoint and walked directly toward the private executive elevators. The security desk manager, a man who had worked there for a decade, looked up in surprise. He knew I was supposed to be on maternity leave for another 2 months. I did not offer a smile or a casual greeting. I simply swiped my highest-level clearance badge across the scanner. The heavy glass gates parted instantly, granting me access to the inner sanctum of the firm. The elevator shot upward, accelerating toward the top floor where the executive board resided. My mind was actively categorizing every financial discrepancy I had uncovered on Tyrell's computer. I was organizing the data into a lethal presentation. When the elevator doors slid open, I stepped onto the plush carpet of the executive suite. The air up here was always perfectly chilled and silent, a stark contrast to the chaos of the city below. I walked past the shocked administrative assistants, ignoring their frantic attempts to check their daily schedules. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the primary boardroom without knocking. Inside, the executive risk committee was already gathered around the massive custom-built conference table. At the head of the table sat our chief executive officer, Julian Vance. He was a ruthless, brilliant financial strategist who valued accuracy and profit above all else. He hated surprises, but he hated losing money even more. Julian looked up from his tablet, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Simone," he stated, his voice a mixture of surprise and stern authority. "You are currently on approved medical leave. We do not have any scheduled reviews requiring your presence today. This boardroom is currently engaged in a closed session regarding the third quarter acquisitions portfolio." I am terminating my leave, effective this exact minute, Julian, I replied, my voice projecting unwavering confidence across the expansive room. I walked directly to the head of the table and stood beside his chair. I am interrupting this closed session because Vanguard Equity is exactly 48 hours away from finalizing a $20 million acquisition that will trigger a massive federal investigation into this firm. I am here to stop us from absorbing a criminal enterprise. A heavy, stunned silence fell over the entire executive committee. Every single pair of eyes locked onto me. Julian slowly placed his tablet face down on the table, signaling that I had his absolute attention. He gestured for me to proceed. I connected my encrypted flash drive to the central presentation system. The massive high-definition screens mounted on the boardroom walls flickered to life. I did not waste time with introductory pleasantries or corporate jargon. I displayed the official Vanguard buyout proposal for Harrison Logistics alongside the hidden, fraudulent internal ledgers I had extracted from Tyrell's unsecured laptop. You are currently reviewing the final phase of acquiring Harrison Logistics. I began pacing slowly at the front of the room. The documents submitted to our valuation team by their chief executive officer indicate a highly profitable legacy transportation network with lucrative municipal contracts. However, the data provided to Vanguard is entirely fabricated. Harrison Logistics is utilizing a highly illegal double-entry bookkeeping system. I tapped a button on my remote, switching the screen to a side-by-side comparison of their reported tax filings and their actual operating losses. I highlighted the massive discrepancies in bright red. The company is actively bleeding capital, I explained coldly. They are severely leveraged and currently operating at a catastrophic monthly loss. To conceal this from our analysts, Harrison has been illegally shifting phantom funds between a network of obscure shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada. They are artificially inflating their daily operating revenue to meet our strict acquisition metrics. Whispers erupted among the senior partners. The chief financial officer leaned forward, squinting at the projected spreadsheets. Are you absolutely certain about these figures, Simone? He asked, his tone laced with serious concern. This level of deception would require systematic collusion at the highest executive levels of their company. I am beyond certain, I confirmed, locking eyes with him. I possess the raw, unaltered data strings exported directly from their restricted administrative server. But the inflated valuation is not our biggest problem. The most immediate threat to Vanguard Equity lies in their federal tax liabilities. I switched the presentation slide one final time, displaying the massive hidden tax deficits Harrison had accumulated over the past 5 years. They are actively hiding millions of dollars in taxable income from the federal government. I stated, my voice echoing with absolute finality. This is not creative accounting. This is severe premeditated federal tax evasion. If Vanguard Equity proceeds with this $20 million buyout, we will legally absorb their entire corporate entity. That means we will inherit their massive toxic debt, and we will become directly liable for their federal crimes. The Internal Revenue Service will trace their hidden shell companies straight back to our acquisition fund. We will face astronomical fines, prolonged federal audits, and catastrophic damage to our firm's pristine reputation. Julian sat back in his leather chair, processing the sheer magnitude of the disaster I had just averted. The room remained incredibly quiet. The executives stared at the screens, fully comprehending the catastrophic bullet they had just dodged. Julian turned to the committee, his jaw clenched tightly. We freeze the acquisition funds immediately, he ordered, his voice echoing with ruthless authority. We cut all communication with their legal team. Julian stood up and turned his sharp gaze toward me. He looked at the detailed, flawless forensic analysis displayed on the screens, and then he looked at me with deep, unmistakable respect. Simone, you just saved this firm $20 million in dead capital and spared us a devastating federal indictment. Your forensic accuracy is absolutely unparalleled. You bypassed every standard protocol today, but your actions were entirely justified. Thank you, Julian, I replied evenly, offering a slight nod. I am simply protecting our assets. Julian leaned over the conference table, placing his hands flat against the polished wood. Effective immediately, you are officially promoted to the position of lead executive auditor. Your first assignment in this new role will be to personally oversee the absolute termination of the Harrison Logistics acquisition. You will construct the formal rejection package. You will draft the mandatory fraud report that we are now legally obligated to submit to the federal authorities. I want you to completely dismantle their proposal and bury them in their own fraudulent paperwork. You have complete autonomy on this assignment. Do whatever is necessary to protect Vanguard. I felt a cold, sharp thrill of pure triumph course through my veins. The promotion was a massive validation of my professional worth. But the real prize was the absolute power Julian had just handed me. I was now the designated executioner of the Harrison Empire. I accept the position, Julian. I said, maintaining my absolute professional composure, while my very heart raced with highly anticipated incredible victory. I will handle the termination of this acquisition personally. The trap was right now fully armed, and I was ready to pull the trigger. Exactly. 48 hours after they threw me into the freezing rain, Harrison and Tyrell walked into the main lobby of Vanguard Equity. I watched their arrival through the live security feed monitored directly from my new corner office. They moved with the aggressive, entitled swagger of men who firmly believed they had successfully conquered the world. They were both dressed in freshly tailored, bespoke Italian suits, sporting expensive silk ties and luxury watches they absolutely could not afford. Harrison walked a few paces ahead, exuding the false confidence of a master manipulator who thought he had just executed the perfect corporate heist. Tyrell trailed slightly behind him, holding a sleek leather briefcase that contained nothing but fraudulent hopes and empty promises. They were acting like triumphant kings arriving to collect their royal tribute, completely convinced they were about to walk out of this glass tower with a life-saving $20 million check. They were absolutely certain that their pathetic, sinking logistics company had successfully fooled one of the most rigorous financial institutions in the country. They stepped into the private executive elevators smiling and clapping each other on the back, completely unaware that they were stepping directly into a high-tech slaughterhouse. The heavy mahogany doors of the primary executive boardroom swung open, and Harrison strode in, flashing his signature charismatic politician smile to the assembled Vanguard board members. Julian Vance sat at the head of the massive custom-built conference table, flanked by our senior legal counsel and the chief financial officer. The atmosphere in the room was chillingly silent, but Harrison, blinded by his own massive ego and desperate greed, completely misread the room's severe tension. He mistook their cold, calculating silence for professional awe. "Gentlemen," Harrison announced, his booming voice filling the expansive room as he unbuttoned his suit jacket and took a seat opposite Julian. "It is an absolute honor to sit down with you all today to finalize this historic acquisition. Harrison Logistics has been a pillar of the Atlanta community for decades, and bringing our vast municipal network under the prestigious Vanguard umbrella is a massive victory for both our organizations." Tyrell nodded vigorously, attempting to mimic his father's authoritative posture, completely oblivious to the fact that the Vanguard executives were looking at them like dead men walking. Julian Vance leaned back in his plush leather chair, steepling his fingers together. He did not return Harrison's warm smile. He did not offer them coffee or water. He simply stared at them with the cold, detached gaze of a predatory shark evaluating its next meal. "We have reviewed your final proposal," Harrison, Julian stated, his voice smooth, but devoid of any warmth. "We have subjected your quarterly reviews, your tax filings, and your municipal contracts to our standard rigorous internal auditing process. However, given the substantial $20 million valuation you have aggressively proposed, we required a secondary, highly specialized forensic review to authorize the final capital release." Harrison's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny bead of sweat forming near his temple, but he quickly recovered his arrogant composure. "Of course," Julian Harrison replied smoothly, waving his hand dismissively. "We welcome any level of scrutiny. Our books are completely transparent, and our operational ledgers are flawless. We operate with absolute integrity." Julian nodded slowly. "I am glad you feel that way, Harrison. Because Vanguard Equity does not authorize acquisitions of this magnitude without the direct final approval of our most senior financial experts. Today, our newly appointed lead executive auditor will deliver the final verdict on the Harrison Logistics acquisition. Whatever decision is presented in this room today is absolute and final. Harrison and Tyrell exchanged a quick, confident glance, fully believing they were about to be praised by some faceless corporate number cruncher. The heavy frosted glass doors at the back of the boardroom slid open with a soft electronic hiss. I stepped into the room. I was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal power suit, my hair pulled back into a sleek, severe style, my posture radiating absolute, uncompromising authority. The soft click of my heels against the polished hardwood floor echoed loudly in the silent room. I did not look like a broken, weeping mother. I did not look like a discarded, working-class charity case. I looked like the executioner. I walked with deliberate, measured steps toward the front of the conference table, coming to a complete stop right beside Julian Vance. I slowly placed my encrypted digital tablet onto the table and looked directly across the room at the two men who had violently thrown my infant daughter into the freezing rain. The physical reaction was immediate and utterly spectacular. The color drained completely from Tyrell's face, leaving him looking like a terrified, sick ghost. His jaw literally dropped open, his eyes bulging as his limited brain struggled violently to process the impossible image standing in front of him. Harrison gripped the edge of the conference table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. His confident, arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Simone Tyrell gasped, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic squeak. "What are you doing here? How did you get past security? You need to leave right now before you ruin my father's meeting." Harrison stood up abruptly, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Julian, I demand an explanation," Harrison shouted, his panic masquerading as false outrage. "This woman is my severely unstable daughter-in-law. She is currently suffering from a massive psychotic break. She has absolutely no business being inside this building. Security needs to remove her immediately." Julian Vance did not even blink. He looked at Harrison with absolute disgust. "Sit down, Harrison," Julian commanded, his voice slicing through the room like a frozen blade. "You are currently speaking to Vanguard Equity's lead executive auditor. You will afford her the absolute respect her position demands, or I will have security remove you instead." Tyrell collapsed back into his chair, his legs apparently giving out beneath him. His eyes darted wildly around the room, finally realizing the horrifying magnitude of his mistake. They had not just mocked a boring accountant. They had systematically abused a high-ranking executive at the exact firm holding their financial salvation. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of emotional distress. I operated in a cold, surgical, and absolutely merciless manner. I tapped the screen of my tablet and the massive high-definition monitors on the boardroom walls flared to life. I did not show them standard corporate presentation slides. I projected their highly illegal, deeply hidden double-entry ledgers for everyone in the room to see. "Let us review your flawless transparency and absolute integrity, Harrison." I began, my voice steady and commanding. "According to the official documents you submitted to this firm, Harrison Logistics generated $4 million in municipal revenue last quarter. However, according to the unrestricted administrative server data I extracted directly from your vice president's unencrypted laptop, your actual operating revenue was a net loss of $2.5 million. Harrison choked, his hand flying to his chest. "You hacked my son's computer," he sputtered, looking frantically at Vanguard's legal counsel. "That is corporate espionage." "I did not hack anything," I corrected, smoothly advancing to the next highly damning slide. "Your incompetent vice president left the top-tier administrative portal wide open and completely unsecured on a home network. But the inflated revenue is the least of your concerns." I turned my attention to the board members. "Gentlemen, as you can clearly see on screen, Harrison Logistics has been utilizing a vast network of obscure shell companies registered under fake names in Delaware. They are using these entities to illegally cycle phantom capital, artificially inflating their daily balance sheets to hide their imminent bankruptcy. Tyrell was staring at the screens, openly hyperventilating, realizing that I had completely dismantled the company he was supposed to inherit. I tapped the screen again, bringing up the most devastating piece of evidence. And finally, I said, looking dead into Harrison's terrified eyes, "We come to your federal tax liabilities. For the past 5 consecutive years, you have actively and intentionally hidden over $8 million in taxable corporate income. You have funneled these funds into offshore private trusts to maintain a lavish personal lifestyle while your company drowns in unrecoverable debt." Harrison tried to formulate a lie, but his mouth just opened and closed silently. "You expected us to absorb your bankrupt shell and inherit your federal crimes." I continued, pressing my hands onto the table. "I am officially rejecting this buyout proposal. Vanguard Equity will not give you a single penny. As a registered financial institution, we are legally obligated to report corporate fraud. I officially submitted everything to the federal tax authorities." "You are both completely and utterly finished right here today, Harrison," I whispered coldly. "Checkmate." The heavy silence that followed my final declaration hung in the chilled boardroom air like a physical weight. I watched the absolute terror solidify in Harrison's eyes as the full reality of his impending destruction finally registered. He opened his mouth to unleash another tirade of insults, but Julian Vance stood up and pointed a rigid finger toward the heavy glass doors. Julian ordered them to vacate the premises immediately before he called building security to have them forcibly removed and handed over to the local authorities. Harrison clamped his jaw shut. His chest heaved with rapid, erratic breaths as he violently shoved his chair back. The expensive leather squeaked loudly against the polished wood. Tyrell scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking so violently that he dropped his sleek leather briefcase onto the floor. The metal clasps popped open, spilling empty folders and useless marketing brochures across the pristine Vanguard Equity carpet. Tyrell scrambled awkwardly on his hands and knees, desperately shoving the meaningless papers back into his bag while the entire executive board watched his humiliating display in absolute disgusted silence. Harrison did not wait for his son. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the boardroom, his face flushed a dangerous mottled shade of crimson. Tyrell finally secured his briefcase and scrambled after his father, practically running to keep up with Harrison's frantic, aggressive strides. The frosted glass doors slid shut behind them, perfectly sealing them out of the sanctuary of wealth and power they had so desperately tried to conquer. I stood calmly beside the presentation screens and watched the live security feed on my encrypted tablet. The camera angles tracked their pathetic retreat through the executive lobby. Harrison was sweating profusely, large, dark patches of moisture rapidly spreading across the underarms of his custom-tailored Italian suit jacket. He aggressively yanked at his expensive silk tie, loosening it from his thick neck as if the very fabric were suddenly suffocating him. He was gasping for air, his polished patriarch persona completely shattered by the absolute certainty of a federal indictment. Tyrell trailed behind him like a frightened, obedient shadow, his shoulders hunched and his head frantically swiveling as they approached the private elevators. When the elevator doors sealed them inside the descending steel box, Harrison completely lost whatever tiny fraction of self-control he had left. He violently slammed his fists against the stainless steel walls of the elevator car. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure, unfiltered panic. The fake logistics empire he had spent decades building on a foundation of lies and tax evasion was officially collapsing into dust. The municipal contracts were gone. The Vanguard bailout was dead. The federal authorities were already mobilizing to freeze his hidden offshore assets and audit every single shell company he had ever registered. Harrison turned his explosive, terrifying rage directly onto his cowardly son. He grabbed Tyrell violently by the lapels of his suit jacket and shoved him hard against the back wall of the elevator. Harrison screamed that this entire catastrophe was entirely Tyrell's fault. He blamed Tyrell for leaving the encrypted corporate laptop completely unsecured on a home network. He blamed Tyrell for underestimating the quiet, observant accountant they had treated like absolute garbage. Harrison barked vicious, desperate orders, saliva flying from his lips as he aggressively shook his son. The plan had to change immediately. The corporate exit strategy was completely dead, so they needed a massive, immediate political bailout to avoid spending the rest of their natural lives in a federal penitentiary. "Call Vanessa right now!" Harrison screamed, his voice raw and echoing loudly in the small metal box. "Call that wealthy girl and beg her for whatever we need. Tell her you love her. Tell her you want to marry her tomorrow morning. We need her father to authorize a massive immediate municipal emergency loan to cover the bleeding accounts before the federal agents freeze our operating capital. We need millions of dollars in untraceable political money today." Tyrell nodded frantically, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his thumbs fumbling awkwardly over the screen as he desperately tried to dial Vanessa's number. The elevator doors slid open at the ground floor lobby, and the two disgraced men practically sprinted across the polished marble floors toward the underground parking garage. They pushed past incoming corporate employees, ignoring the indignant shouts of the people they shoved aside. They were operating on pure, unadulterated survival instinct, completely blinded by their own desperate greed and their monumental arrogance. They reached the executive parking level, and Tyrell frantically unlocked his sleek, imported luxury sports car. The expensive vehicle chirped loudly, echoing through the concrete cavern. Tyrell practically dove into the driver's seat, while Harrison shoved himself roughly into the passenger side. The powerful engine roared to life, and Tyrell slammed his foot violently onto the accelerator. The tires screeched loudly against the painted concrete as he aggressively whipped the sports car out of the parking structure and merged recklessly into the heavy, congested flow of downtown Atlanta traffic. Inside the speeding luxury vehicle, the atmosphere was a toxic mixture of suffocating panic and aggressive delusion. Harrison was barking continuous, frantic orders, demanding that Tyrell secure Vanessa's political connections immediately. Tyrell dialed Vanessa's number and put the phone on speaker, balancing the device on the center console while weaving dangerously between slower-moving vehicles. The phone rang endlessly, the monotonous tone amplifying the severe tension inside the small, enclosed cabin. Vanessa finally answered on the fifth ring, her voice sounding groggy and slightly annoyed. She complained that she was still trying to unpack her extensive collection of designer dresses into the massive custom closets at the estate. Tyrell forced a bright, charming, and completely fake tone into his shaking voice. He ignored her complaints and immediately launched into a frantic, high-pressure romantic manipulation. He told Vanessa that he had just realized he could not wait another single moment to start their perfect life together. He claimed he wanted to solidify their powerful alliance immediately. He heavily implied that his family logistics company was on the verge of a massive historic expansion, and that he needed her powerful father to secure a short-term bridge loan to facilitate the incredible growth. He spun a desperate, chaotic web of lies, promising her luxury elite status and a quick, glamorous wedding if she could just get her father to release the emergency municipal funds by the end of the business day. Vanessa sounded hesitant and slightly confused by his sudden aggressive urgency, but the toxic allure of marrying into the supposedly wealthy Harrison family kept her on the line. Tyrell told her to stay exactly where she was. He promised he was speeding back to the grand estate right now to celebrate their brilliant future together. He ended the call, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned a stark, alarming white. He looked over at his father, desperately seeking approval for his pathetic, manipulative performance. Harrison simply scowled and ordered him to drive faster. As Tyrell aggressively navigated the congested city streets, his mind raced with frantic, desperate contingency plans. He was operating under a massive fundamental delusion. He genuinely believed he still held the ultimate power over his physical domain. He truly believed he was speeding back to a secure fortress where he could safely hide from the massive financial apocalypse I had just violently unleashed upon his family. He thought he still controlled the massive Beacon Hill-style estate. He thought he could just waltz through the front doors, pour himself an expensive glass of aged bourbon, and easily convince a wealthy heiress to hand over millions of dollars in political favors. His thoughts shifted rapidly from the pending federal investigation to the immediate preservation of his luxury assets. Tyrell reasoned that if the worst-case scenario actually occurred, and the government authorities froze the corporate accounts he needed to secure his high-value personal items immediately, he mentally cataloged the expensive designer watches sitting in his velvet-lined display cases, the large stacks of emergency cash he kept hidden in his office safe, and the valuable artwork hanging on the mansion walls. He planned to quickly pack all his easily movable, untraceable assets into heavy duffel bags. If Vanessa's father refused to provide the emergency municipal bailout, Tyrell fully intended to grab his hidden cash, abandon his failing father, and flee the state before the federal indictments were officially unsealed. He was a coward to his absolute core, entirely willing to sacrifice anyone and anything to save his own skin. He completely underestimated the precise, calculated speed of my retaliation. He falsely assumed the legal system moved slowly. He thought an eviction or a property dispute would take months of tedious mediation and boring court dates. He had absolutely no idea that while he was sweating in the Vanguard boardroom, a highly aggressive, ruthless real estate attorney had already marched an emergency ejectment order into a judge's chambers. Tyrell thought he had hours, perhaps even days, to organize his escape and secure his stolen wealth. He did not realize his time had already completely run out. The luxury sports car tore through the affluent tree-lined streets of the wealthy suburban neighborhoods. Harrison was silent now, staring blankly out the passenger window, his mind completely consumed by the terrifying reality of federal prison sentences and the total loss of his country club status. Tyrell focused entirely on the road, his heart pounding a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. The familiar towering brick walls of their exclusive community finally came into view. Tyrell felt a sudden false sense of profound relief wash over him as he passed the manicured entrance signs. He believed he had successfully outrun the storm. He believed he was finally safe inside his elite, untouchable bubble. Tyrell pressed his foot on the gas pedal, eager to reach the sanctuary of the house. He needed the comfort of his expensive leather furniture and the reassuring presence of his stolen lifestyle to calm his shattered nerves. He desperately needed to feel like a powerful executive again, rather than a terrified criminal fleeing a crime scene. He believed the estate was his ultimate safe harbor, a fortress that my ordinary accounting salary could never possibly touch. He was completely blinded by years of unearned privilege and deep-seated arrogance. He accelerated up the gentle incline of the neighborhood, the roar of the engine masking the sound of his own heavy, panicked breathing. He was racing toward his supposed salvation, entirely unaware that he was actually speeding headfirst into a brutal, perfectly orchestrated public humiliation. He rounded the final corner, his eyes fixed on the horizon, absolutely certain he still controlled his destiny. He was horribly, irreparably wrong. The sleek sports car swung aggressively around the final curve of the manicured neighborhood, carrying Tyrell and Harrison toward what they falsely believed was their impenetrable sanctuary. Tyrell slammed on the brakes so hard that the tires shrieked against the pristine asphalt. The vehicle violently jerked to a halt directly in front of the grand wrought iron gates. The safe harbor they desperately expected to find was entirely gone. In its place was a scene of absolute, heavily orchestrated chaos. Two prominent county sheriff cruisers were parked diagonally across the sweeping driveway, their blue and red emergency lights flashing rhythmically against the imposing brick facade of the estate. A massive industrial-sized moving truck was backed straight up to the grand entrance. A crew of burly men in matching uniforms were aggressively hauling heavy furniture and expensive personal items out of the front doors. Tyrell stared through the windshield, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. He wildly assumed this was some kind of catastrophic mistake. He thought the federal agents had somehow beaten them to the house. He frantically threw the car into park, shoved the heavy car door open and sprinted up the long, winding driveway with Harrison stumbling heavily right behind him. As Tyrell closed the distance, the sheer poetic justice of the scene finally registered in his panicking mind. This was not a federal raid. This was a completely methodical, heavily enforced eviction. The meticulously manicured front lawn and the circular stone driveway were currently littered with their most prized, expensive possessions. Piled haphazardly near the very same muddy puddle where Harrison had violently thrown my daughter's diaper bag just a week prior were Tyrell's custom-fitted golf clubs. They were spilling out of their leather bags scattered carelessly across the wet concrete. Kendra's extensive collection of limited edition designer purses, her expensive silk robes, and her velvet jewelry boxes were dumped unceremoniously into large, ugly plastic bins. And resting right at the edge of the driveway, sitting precariously close to the damp grass, was a towering stack of brand new premium luxury luggage. It was the exact luggage Vanessa had been eagerly unpacking in the master suite just a few hours earlier. Kendra was standing in the middle of the driveway wearing the same expensive clothes she had flaunted on social media, but her smug arrogance was entirely gone. She was shrieking hysterically at a large moving man trying desperately to yank a box of her expensive shoes out of his firm grip. The mover completely ignored her frantic pulling, easily sidestepping her frantic grasps. Vanessa stood a few feet away, her arms tightly crossed over her chest. Her glamorous face contorted into a mask of pure absolute confusion and rising horror. She was watching her pristine, wealthy reality completely disintegrate on a suburban lawn. Tyrell charged past his sister, his face red with unadulterated fury. "What the hell is going on here?" he screamed, his voice cracking wildly as he approached the front steps. "Who authorized this? This is my property. I will have every single one of you arrested for breaking and entering." The heavy oak front doors swung wide open. I stepped out onto the grand covered porch, wearing my sharp charcoal power suit, my posture radiating absolute, unbreakable authority. I was flanked by a tall, heavily armed sheriff deputy holding a thick clipboard. I looked down at Tyrell, my face completely devoid of any emotion, mirroring the exact same cold detachment he had shown me during the freezing rainstorm. In my right hand, I held the official, heavily stamped property deed. In my left hand, I held the emergency judge-signed ejectment order. "Nobody is getting arrested for breaking and entering, Tyrell," I stated, my voice projecting loud and clear over the chaotic noise of the moving crew. "I authorize this removal. You are currently standing on private property that belongs exclusively to my holding company. I filed an emergency ejectment order this morning, and the judge agreed that you, your sister, and your guest are unauthorized squatters. The sheriff is simply here to enforce the legal eviction." Tyrell stopped dead in his tracks. He stared up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and sheer terror. He looked at the legal documents in my hands, then looked over at the sheriff deputy, who offered a firm, validating nod. Harrison finally reached the driveway, gasping heavily for air, his expensive suit completely rumpled and soaked in cold sweat. He saw me standing on the porch, holding the absolute power over his physical domain, and he physically staggered backward as if he had been punched. "This is impossible," Tyrell stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the massive house. "This estate belongs to the Harrison Family Trust. My father bought this place. We let you live here." I walked slowly down the stone steps, stopping just a few feet away from my cowardly husband. I made sure my voice was loud enough for everyone in the driveway to hear, especially Vanessa. "Your father never paid a single dime for this estate, Tyrell," I explained with slow, deliberate precision. 3 years ago, when you secretly destroyed your credit score with illegal sports gambling debts, I purchased this entire property myself. I used my pristine credit and my executive corporate bonuses from Vanguard Equity. I formed a private limited liability company called Southside Horizon to hold the asset and protect myself from your massive financial liabilities. Your name is nowhere on the deed. Your father's name is nowhere on the mortgage. This house is mine. You have absolutely no legal right to be here." Vanessa gasped loudly from across the driveway. She uncrossed her arms and took a hesitant, fearful step forward. The carefully constructed illusion Tyrell had sold her was shattering into a million jagged pieces. "Tyrell," she demanded, her voice shrill and demanding. "What is she talking about? You told me you own this estate." You told me your family was securing a massive municipal expansion. You said you were wealthy. Tyrell spun around to face Vanessa, holding his hands out in a desperate, pathetic gesture of appeasement. Vanessa, baby, please do not listen to her. Tyrell begged, sweat pouring down his forehead. She is just a bitter, crazy ex-wife trying to ruin our happiness. I can explain everything. We just need to call your father and get that emergency municipal loan approved right now. Once the funds clear, I will buy us an even bigger house. Just make the call. I did not let him finish his pathetic manipulation. I turned my attention directly to the wealthy heiress. He does not need a loan for an expansion. Vanessa Y interjected, cutting through Tyrell's desperate lies with surgical precision. He needs your father's political money to pay off the federal government. Harrison Logistics is completely bankrupt. They have been running a massive double-entry bookkeeping scheme and hiding millions of dollars in tax liabilities. I just personally rejected their fraudulent buyout proposal at Vanguard Equity, and I officially submitted their deeply doctored financial records directly to the Internal Revenue Service. Tyrell is not a wealthy executive. He is a broke, unemployed fraud facing imminent federal indictment. He was trying to marry you today solely to use your family's money as a criminal defense fund. The absolute silence that fell over the driveway was deafening. The only sounds were the distant wail of a police siren and the rustling of the wind through the tall oak trees. Vanessa stared at Tyrell, her eyes wide with deep, unfiltered revulsion. She looked at his sweating, panicked face, his rumpled suit, and the pathetic pile of his golf clubs scattered in the dirt. She realized instantly that she had almost permanently anchored her prestigious political family to a massive, toxic federal crime scene. Tyrell took a frantic step toward her, reaching out to grab her arm. Vanessa, please, you have to believe me. Do not ever touch me again, Vanessa screamed. She swung her arm back and delivered a vicious, echoing slap directly across Tyrell's face. The sharp crack rang out loudly in the cold air. Tyrell stumbled backward, clutching his reddened cheek in absolute shock. You are a pathetic, disgusting liar, she spat, her voice trembling with intense fury. You tried to drag my father into your criminal garbage. I am canceling the engagement right now, and if you ever try to contact me or my family again, I will have my father destroy whatever miserable pieces of your life are left. Vanessa aggressively pulled her phone from her designer purse and rapidly dialed a local cab service. She did not even bother to gather her expensive luggage from the wet driveway. She simply turned her back on Tyrell, marching swiftly toward the front gate to wait for her ride, leaving her entire toxic relationship rotting in the dirt behind her. Tyrell stood completely frozen, holding his stinging cheek, watching his wealthy future and his political salvation walk entirely away. The realization of his total absolute ruin finally crashed down upon him. He had no money, no home, no elite fiancé, and a looming federal prison sentence. He fell to his knees right there on the wet concrete, the exact same spot where I had stood shivering in the rain just a week before. Kendra had stopped fighting with the movers. She sank down onto her plastic bins of designer clothes and buried her face in her hands, breaking into loud, ugly, uncontrollable sobs. Her fake high society status was completely gone. She was going to have to find a cheap apartment and get a real job entirely stripped of the Harrison wealth she had always used to mock me. Harrison stood near the edge of the lawn, looking like a broken, hollow shell of a man. His shoulders were slumped, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading silently for a mercy he had never once offered me or my newborn daughter. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt the powerful, clean surge of absolute justice. I walked over to the edge of the porch, looking down at the weeping, shattered remnants of the arrogant family that had tried to destroy me. I checked the sleek silver watch on my wrist. You have exactly 5 minutes to gather whatever garbage you can physically carry off my property, I announced, my voice completely cold and void of any compassion. When that 5 minutes is up, the sheriff deputy will officially arrest anyone still standing on this driveway for criminal trespassing. I suggest you move quickly. It looks like it is going to rain. I turned my back on their desperate sobbing and walked confidently back inside my massive, quiet, and completely secure home. The heavy oak front door swung shut behind me, The locks clicked into place with a satisfying permanent finality. The real estate strike was a total success, but the ultimate federal destruction was still rapidly approaching. 1 week passed in absolute tranquility inside my home. The silence was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was the clear, refreshing quiet of a hard-fought victory. While I spent my days enjoying peaceful mornings with Layla and settling into my powerful executive role at Vanguard Equity, the financial storm I engineered was reaching its devastating climax. The formal fraud report I meticulously compiled and submitted to the Internal Revenue Service did not just trigger a standard review, it ignited an aggressive, sweeping federal investigation. The government does not take kindly to massive tax evasion, and they take it even less kindly when the paper trail is handed to them, perfectly categorized by a senior forensic auditor. The final fatal domino fell on a crisp Tuesday morning. I sat at my sleek glass desk in my corner office sipping hot coffee, watching the breaking news stream across my secondary monitor. At exactly 9 in the morning, a fleet of unmarked black government vehicles swarmed the corporate headquarters of Harrison Logistics. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with thick yellow letters printed across their backs aggressively breached the glass doors of the facility. They did not knock. They did not ask for permission. They flooded the lobby carrying empty cardboard boxes and specialized digital extraction equipment. They immediately seized every single computer, every filing cabinet, and every server rack in the building. The regular hard-working employees stood outside in the parking lot filming the massive federal raid on their cell phones, watching in total shock as the supposed legacy empire was dismantled piece by piece. The local news helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting the definitive end of the Harrison dynasty to the entire state of Georgia. But the most spectacular public humiliation was reserved entirely for Harrison himself. He was not at his corporate office when the federal raid occurred. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to maintain his crumbling facade of wealth and power, Harrison had gone to his exclusive, highly restricted country club. He was sitting in the opulent wood-paneled dining room, surrounded by Atlanta's most elite politicians, wealthy judges, and prominent business owners. He was aggressively swirling an expensive glass of aged scotch, attempting to spin a fabricated narrative about a temporary cash flow problem to anyone who would listen. He was desperately trying to secure a private, under-the-table loan to replace the municipal bailout Vanessa's father had violently pulled off the table. He was mid-sentence, loudly boasting about his untouchable legacy when the heavy oak doors of the country club dining room swung wide open. 2 federal agents flanked by local law enforcement officers marched directly across the plush carpet. The entire room went dead silent. The clinking of crystal glasses and the soft murmur of high society conversations ceased instantly. The agents did not offer Harrison the professional courtesy of a quiet exit. They approached his table, loudly stated his full name, and formally placed him under arrest for severe corporate fraud, systemic tax evasion, and interstate wire fraud. Harrison stood up, his face flushing a dangerous dark purple. He sputtered defensively, attempting to leverage his elite social standing, loudly demanding they release him and threatening to call the mayor. The agents remained completely unfazed by his pathetic posturing. Right there in front of the exact same wealthy, judgmental peers Harrison had spent his entire life desperately trying to impress, the federal agents firmly forced his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly through the silent dining room. The ultimate patriarch was publicly reduced to a common disgraced criminal. As the agents aggressively marched Harrison through the crowded room and out the front doors, the elite patrons actively turned their backs on him. The same people who had happily drank his expensive champagne and attended his lavish galas were now whispering in absolute disgust. He was officially radioactive. His fake polished reputation was permanently obliterated. He was shoved into the back of a waiting federal vehicle, stripped of his bespoke suits and his arrogant pride, heading straight toward a cold concrete cell. The immediate collateral damage of Harrison's highly public arrest was absolutely catastrophic for the rest of his toxic family. The moment the federal indictment was officially unsealed, the government aggressively moved to secure all potential assets. The authorities immediately froze the massive secretive family trust fund. Every single hidden offshore account, every joint bank ledger, and every corporate credit line was instantly locked down by the federal government. The endless pipeline of unearned wealth that had funded their arrogant cruelty was permanently shut off. Kendra was the very first to feel the brutal, crushing impact of the total financial freeze. After being violently evicted from my property, she had been forced to move into a cheap, cramped apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. She had managed to salvage a few of her designer bags, clinging desperately to the fading illusion of her high society status. She was walking out of a discount grocery store carrying cheap plastic bags when the brutal reality of her new life finally caught up to her. A heavy-duty commercial tow truck was backed aggressively into her assigned parking space. The driver was actively securing the heavy metal chains around the axles of her pristine luxury white SUV. The vehicle had been entirely funded by the now frozen family trust, and the lease payments were severely delinquent. Kendra dropped her groceries onto the hot pavement and sprinted across the parking lot, screaming hysterically at the tow truck driver. She wildly grabbed at the heavy chains, crying and begging him to stop, loudly announcing her prestigious last name and demanding he release her property. The driver simply ignored her frantic, embarrassing tantrums, handing her a printed repossession notice before climbing into his cab. Kendra stood in the middle of the crowded lower-class parking lot, wearing expensive designer sunglasses and a silk top, openly sobbing as she watched her shiny luxury car being towed down the street. Her neighbors, people she would have previously mocked and discarded as absolute trash, watched her public meltdown from their balconies. She was entirely stripped of her transportation, her credit cards, and her fake superiority. She was finally forced to live the exact same difficult working-class reality she had relentlessly mocked me for enduring. But the most severe and satisfying punishment was reserved entirely for Tyrell. My cowardly, abusive husband had lost absolutely everything in the span of a single week. He had lost his beautiful, loyal wife. He had lost his innocent newborn daughter. He had lost his massive, luxurious estate. He had lost his wealthy, politically connected heiress. And now, with his father sitting in a federal holding cell and the logistics company completely destroyed, Tyrell had lost his inflated corporate title and his endless supply of trust fund cash. Tyrell quickly discovered that his impressive resume was entirely worthless. His title as vice president was a complete joke in the actual corporate world. When he desperately attempted to secure employment at other prominent logistics firms in Atlanta, his applications were instantly tossed into the garbage. Nobody was willing to hire the disgraced, incompetent son of an indicted federal criminal. He was legally branded as a massive corporate liability. The very name Harrison, which he had used as a shield his entire life, was now an inescapable curse. With zero savings, no professional skills, and the threat of severe legal fees looming over his head, Tyrell was brutally forced to face the harsh, unforgiving reality of actual physical labor. The man who had spent his entire adult life wearing expensive tailored suits, sipping premium bourbon in air-conditioned executive offices, and mocking the working class was forced to accept the only job willing to hire him. He was hired as a basic entry-level warehouse associate at a massive non-air-conditioned retail distribution center just outside the city limits. His daily reality was now governed by strict, unforgiving time clocks and grueling, back-breaking physical labor. He was forced to wear a cheap, generic uniform vest. He spent 10 agonizing hours a day standing on hard concrete floors, aggressively lifting heavy cardboard boxes, unloading dusty shipping containers, and operating loud, greasy machinery. He was constantly yelled at by demanding supervisors who did not care about his old money lineage or his country club background. He was doing the manual, exhausting labor he had spent his privileged life looking down upon. His manicured hands quickly grew calloused and blistered. His expensive haircuts grew out, and his posture slumped under the heavy exhaustion of genuine minimum wage work. He was no longer a conquering corporate king. He was just a tired, desperate man struggling to pay for basic groceries and a tiny studio apartment. The crushing humiliation of his new reality was the ultimate inescapable consequence of his own lazy arrogance and his cruel, unforgiving heart. I sat in the quiet warmth of my sunlit living room, enjoying the absolute serenity that had finally settled over my life. The relentless chaos of the Harrison family was nothing but a fading memory, a storm I had successfully navigated and completely destroyed. My phone vibrated gently on the glass coffee table, breaking the comfortable silence. I glanced down at the screen and saw an unknown number calling. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, a voicemail notification popped up. I tapped the icon and lifted the phone to my ear. Tyrell was on the other end, his voice completely unrecognizable. He sounded broken, exhausted, and desperately pathetic. He was crying, his breath hitching as he struggled to speak over the loud, mechanical humming of what sounded like a busy warehouse floor. I heard his new supervisor shouting orders in the background, a stark reminder of his crushing reality. "Simone, please," Tyrell begged, his voice cracking with heavy emotion. "Please just pick up the phone. I made a terrible mistake. I was blind and I let my father poison my mind. I lost everything, Simone. I have absolutely nothing left. I miss you. I miss my beautiful daughter. Layla needs her father. Please let me come home. We can fix this. I will do whatever it takes." I listened to his frantic weeping pleas with absolute unwavering detachment. He was not crying for me. He was not crying for Layla. He was crying for himself. He was crying for the luxury cars, the custom suits, and the effortless wealth he had foolishly thrown away. He was using our daughter as a manipulative prop to try and crawl back into the life I built. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or hesitation. I moved my finger across the screen and firmly pressed delete. His pathetic apologies and his desperate tears were completely deleted from my existence without a second thought. I permanently blocked the number, ensuring his toxic voice would never reach my ears again. I set the phone down and looked around my beautiful, restored home. The massive estate was no longer a cold fortress filled with arrogant guests and fake smiles. It was a true sanctuary. The heavy curtains had been removed, allowing bright natural light to flood the rooms. The pretentious, uncomfortable leather furniture had been completely replaced with soft, inviting fabrics and warm, vibrant colors that reflected my own personal style. It was a home filled with genuine love, safety, and absolute peace. The silence here was deeply healing, a beautiful reminder that I had successfully purged every trace of their toxic presence from our lives. I walked upstairs to the nursery, the very same room where Tyrell had cruelly questioned my loyalty and rejected our child. Layla was awake, lying comfortably in her crib, kicking her tiny legs and cooing softly at a colorful mobile spinning above her head. I leaned over the railing and scooped her up into my arms. She smiled widely, her bright eyes locking onto mine. She was the most precious thing in my world. I held her close, inhaling her sweet, innocent scent, feeling a profound wave of gratitude wash over me. She would never have to endure the suffocating pressure of the Harrison family. She would never be taught to value money over human decency. She would grow up knowing exactly how much she is loved, knowing that she is incredibly strong, and knowing that she belongs to a mother who would burn down an entire empire to protect her. My professional life had blossomed just as beautifully. The executive board at Vanguard Equity had been thoroughly impressed by my surgical dismantling of the Harrison logistics fraud. My ability to remain completely objective and to protect the firm from a catastrophic federal liability did not go unnoticed. Julian Vance had called me into his office last week and officially promoted me to a full director position. I now commanded an entire division of elite forensic auditors. I was respected, highly compensated, and recognized for my brilliant analytical mind. I had completely shed the false degrading labels my in-laws had violently tried to force upon me. I was not a charity case. I was not a simple, boring paper pusher. I was a formidable, highly successful executive who controlled her own destiny. The financial compensation from my new role allowed me to secure a pristine future for Layla. I set up a robust educational trust fund entirely in her name, guaranteeing she will have access to the absolute best universities in the world. She will walk onto any campus knowing she truly belongs there, funded by hard work and absolute integrity, not by generational fraud and criminal deceit. Sitting in my plush rocking chair with Layla resting warmly against my chest, I reflected on the incredible journey of the past few months. I had learned the most valuable lesson of my entire life. True, lasting power does not require screaming matches in the middle of the night. It does not require public temper tantrums or hurling expensive diaper bags into muddy puddles. True power requires intense strategy. It requires unyielding patience. It requires the emotional discipline to observe your enemies, to quietly gather undeniable evidence and to strike only when the trap is perfectly set. Most importantly, it requires recognizing your own immense undeniable value, even when the people closest to you are actively trying to make you feel completely worthless. They thought throwing a mother and her newborn into the rain would break me. But when you push a woman into the storm, don't be surprised when she comes back as lightning. Have you ever had in-laws who looked down on you because of your background? How did you prove them wrong? Share your stories in the comments below and don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time. Until next. Know your worth and never let anyone evict you from your own power.